Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is Ian from SOFTRAX, joined today by Tony Sondhi. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope everybody is staying safe, staying healthy, and we're looking forward very much to this presentation. I'm the marketing coordinator for SOFTRAX. SOFTRAX is a leading provider of revenue recognition software and complex billing automation software. We're a revenue management company, especially with regards to ASC 606. We have a long track record of helping companies automate their revenue management processes, automate complex billing, RevRec. And I'm joined today by Tony Sondhi with A.C. Sondhi and Associates. Tony, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ian. Hello to the audience. I am a financial consultant. I provide investment and financial consulting advisory services. I've spent a fair amount of my time over the last several years implementing 606. I'm currently helping two companies implement IFRS 15. So I work on both of those accounting regimes. I have been working with SOFTRAX, and I'm very happy to say that for more than 15 years. So I've worked with them starting many, many years ago. And I'm very happy to be here today as well. And we picked a topic. We're going to launch this webcast series today, and we'll plan at least one more in May, and hopefully maybe more than that. We invite you to send us topics that you want to learn more about with respect to the implications of COVID-19 for those issues that you face in your daily work. So in that, if you feel we have enough people, we can start with the first, or I can say a little bit more about the pandemic and so on and what I'm going to discuss today. So that gives us a few more people before we launch the first polling question.
I believe that a few people are still trickling in, so it is up to you. I will just say we're thrilled to have Tony today, and we are very much looking forward to learning from his expertise.
All right, so let me launch into a few more comments about COVID-19 and what I'm trying to do here today, what I'd like to do here today. So obviously, the pandemic has created a disruption and a dislocation in the economy today. All of us are faced with that disruption, and it raises some very important questions. And I like to think about financial reporting and every component of the financial statements from three perspectives: amount, timing, and uncertainty. The amount is what we do in accounting and financial reporting as measurement. The timing is what we think of in terms of recognition. The uncertainty with respect to the amount and timing for any given accounting number or item, that's dealt with by disclosures. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has an impact on at least one of those three, and for some items, maybe all three of them. And what we've done in the past, this is the second COVID-19 implications for financial reporting webcast that I've conducted. The first one last week on Tuesday dealt primarily with lease concessions. And on the 10th of April, the FASB had issued a Q&A on lease concessions. And in fact, this morning, they issued a Q&A on derivatives. So if you're working with derivatives and have some concerns, please go to the FASB website and you'll find the Q&A on derivatives. You'll also find the Q&A on lease concessions. And that Q&A dealt primarily with deferral of rental payments. So sometimes the lessor allows a little bit more time to pay. And the question was, how should the lessor account for that rent deferral? And in the lease concessions Q&A, the staff said that because this is expected to be a temporary dislocation, they don't want companies to necessarily treat it as a lease modification. The argument being that it doesn't change the economics of the lease transaction. Our question today is, what is the impact of COVID-19 on variable revenue streams? Right? So that's what we're going to take a look at. All right. So Ian, I think maybe we can launch the first polling question.
We certainly can. So if you'd like to speak about it first, our first question is, what is your firm's status regarding deal desk optimization? So I'll go ahead and launch the question. Tony, I'm not sure if you'd like to say a few words about the question.
Yes, I shall. So deal desks, some people call them revenue operations, others call them sales operations. And in many places where they do have deal desks or think about something like that, that's where the sales and the finance team come together. The idea being that sales teams like to close transactions, and if they include terms and conditions in contracts that have an impact on the performance obligations, on the transaction price, and or discounting and or, let's say, allocations, then the finance team would like to know about it as soon as possible. So we give you 5 choices. Our first choice is for those of you that don't have a deal desk, or it's very rudimentary. Okay. And at best, what happens is that you're thinking about it, but you haven't done anything. The second is where you have a basic deal desk, where the meetings between the sales and the finance team are informal. At the third level, you would have a formal deal desk, but it's in its early stages. And the fourth is where you have a seasoned deal desk. You've been operating it for some period of time. And the length of time depends on your revenue cycle and so on. But if you've done it for a couple of revenue cycles, 3 revenue cycles maybe, you could probably be approaching that. And then finally, of course, you have the fully operational deal desk. Now, just one last word while you're thinking about this. There is no right or wrong answer to these polling questions, of course. We're just trying to understand what you're doing and how, learning a little bit more about operations, and at the same time meeting the requirements for the CPE that NASBA places on us for webcasts of this type, where we need a certain number of polling questions. We'll try to make sure that the material, the content we're presenting is, at a level that keeps your interest, and hopefully you'll learn a few things from it. I think of the deal desk a little bit differently. I approach it from an integrated information systems perspective. So I think of the sales team, the IT, and the finance team. So that's the way I look at it. And have you captured about 80-90% of the responses so far, Ian?
Yes, we have. So if anyone is still thinking, please go ahead and cast your vote. And if not, I will go ahead and close the poll in just a few seconds.
And in the meantime, you know what, Ian, you could put in the results that I have from the last few months that I've been conducting this poll in my other webcasts, and then we can compare that to the results you tell me about.
All right, I certainly will. So closing in 3, 2, 1. And I'll go ahead and pull up the historical results. So on the screen here, we have a list of results of the same polling question as it's been posed in various webcasts for the last several months. So Tony, this time around, 31% of our attendees said that they have no deal desk or have not started their assessment. Another 31 said they have a basic deal desk structure implemented. 9% answered for a formal deal desk. 13% answered they had a seasoned deal desk, and 15 said they were fully operational with detailed structure.
Okay, so that's pretty good. There's the past few, or the 4 audiences that I have polled, we had a slightly higher no deal desk answer, but the rest of them seem fairly good. So that was very helpful. Thank you. All right. So we can, move on to our next slide, which simply talks about the deal desk services that I provide, and then the slide after that was the introductory COVID-19 slide that I have discussed and made a few comments about so far. So let's move on then to the next slide. Let's begin the webcast in terms of the main topic of discussion. So the objective today is to talk about the implications of COVID-19 for variable revenue streams. You'll recall a few moments ago I said the FASB had a Q&A on lease concessions and rent deferrals. And there, in the light of the fact that a lease term can be several years, the temporary rent deferral does not change the economics of the leasing transaction that much. And therefore, the staff said not to think of it in terms of a lease modification, because a lease modification itself is or represents a change in the economics of the transaction. Our question here is that if you have a variable revenue stream, are the economics of the transaction affected to the extent that you need to adjust the estimated numbers you've provided? Now, this slide tells you about the potential sources of variability. So, of course, things like discounts, for example, that are offered, since you don't know exactly how many people will take those discounts, if there's time limits and if there are other conditions for them, rebates, refunds, etc., those can cause variability. The incentive performance, bonuses, etc., those can create issues. And then, of course, you could have penalties. So now this is not an exhaustive list, but it does come, and I've given you the source, which paragraph I draw from it in 606. I guess what I could have done is also added the paragraph number from IFRS 15. I'll have to keep that in mind. Okay, so that's just the basics. Let's move on then to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, the FASB in 606, in the new revenue model, had said that when you have a variable revenue stream, which means that the amount of the consideration that you expect, the transaction price that you actually expect to see, in case that that's variable, you have actually two different approaches that you can use. So one is the expected amount, and that expected amount, in a sense, it's the sum of the probability weighted amounts based on a fairly significant number of transactions. So in a sense, there is sort of a statistical basis for this. It says that in the past, take the case that we're going to use. Let's assume that you are a company that develops antivirus software, and you put that on a CD and send it over to Best Buy. Let's stay with the CD example. And based on the last several years, say 3 years or 4 years of experience, you know how long it takes Best Buy to sell the CDs you've sent them. You have an idea of what kind of discounting you'd have to provide. And another way of looking at it is that it tells you what the returns are. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking at. That's where you would use the expected sum, because you have a past history, you've done it several times, and you know what you were able to sell. The alternative approach, the second method, is effectively the most likely outcome, or the amount, right? So generally speaking, this works best when the contract has two possibilities. It's a binary condition. Either you will earn a performance bonus or you will not. And there was a slight change in the way we deal with this in 606 relative to 605. the basis on which you select the method to use is the one that gives you the best answer given the facts and circumstances of the variable revenue stream that you're looking at. Okay. Excuse me. Now, the other thing is that some of you may be thinking, well, there's another way to approach variable revenue streams as well. And I agree. And that is the approach that is in 606.10.55.15. So that's we're talking about the case where the contract allows you to bill your customer for the amount of performance you've completed. So for example, think about the case where your software allows the customers to complete payroll transactions. So, and you know how many times they use that software in a quarter, let's say. So at the end of the quarter, they've prepared 10,000 payroll transactions. So what you can do is at the end of the 3 months, you can send the customer a bill for the 10,000. Now that one you don't need to develop any estimates or anything because you're entitled to that amount contractually and so on. So 55-15 is a very good and a time saving in a sense and fairly straightforward approach to apply. We're not talking about that one. We're not talking about the one with the binary outcomes today. We're only talking about the one where you would use the expected amount approach. In other words, you're using the sum of the probability weighted amounts that you expect, and it's based on past transactions. So let's move on then. So you see in some slides take a little bit more time than the others do.
As expected.
So, yeah. Yes. Okay, so how do you apply this? Now, you're allowed to apply this when you can satisfy, and I should have said this methodology, when you have two pieces, or two criteria that are satisfied. One is about the evidence. And there the board says that if you have enough experience with that type of transaction, or you have access to the experience of others, other competitors, other companies in that industry who've been doing this sort of thing. So either one of those sources of evidence, and sometimes you might have both, and you have access to that. The second criterion is a little bit more important, and that has to do with predictive content. So the point is that you have to have enough experience, or in other words, enough evidence that allows you to comfortably and so be reasonably assured, let's say to use accounting language, that you are going to achieve a certain amount of the transaction price. You'll realize that. Or it allows you to determine what the returns are, what discounts you have to offer. So any one of those sources of variability that I started with, if you have enough evidence and that evidence or experience has sufficient predictive quality, then it allows you to do that. Then you may use this methodology. So please keep in mind, this is what we're talking about here with respect to those. Stay with my example of having sent over the antivirus software to Best Buy, and based on prior experience with Best Buy, and based on the features that our antivirus software has, and comparing that to what the competitors are doing, where we do better, where we don't do as well, etc. We look at all that. We look at the competitive landscape. We have the past history. We know what the current market conditions are, and we look at how much time we've given Best Buy to achieve that, and we apply that analysis to figure out what it is. Okay. Now, it's very important, therefore, that you meet, of course, both criteria. Now, and you have to consider various factors in order to apply this. So let's look at those factors on our next slide. And on the next slide, then we begin with a number of factors. So the first factor has to do with control. And there the issue is whether the variability that the earned revenue stream faces whether that is susceptible to factors that are in or out of your control. A discount is one thing as compared to market volatility or obsolescence. The features on your competitors' software, antivirus software, are not in your control. You may be aware of them, and you may have done a lot of good work in figuring out what kinds of features are necessary today. But as you know, viruses keep changing. Maybe that wasn't such a great example given the current conditions, but there it is. We do have it here. Our second is the issue of the evidence. Okay, so the point is that if you only have limited evidence either of your own or that from other sources, then the limited data that you have, the limited experience that you have, may not allow you to develop or derive inferences that are actually going to hold up. The third factor that we talked about then, of course, we talk about here, of course, is the predictability. Remember, if you have limited evidence, then it's unlikely that it gives you a sufficient number. You may recall the years that you've spent doing VISO fair value analysis where we had a bell curve approach. The common question there always had to do with how many transactions do I need, right? So what is it that allows me to say that the sampling I'm doing will provide inferences that hold up in the population? And by the way, interestingly enough, Ian, this reminds me of a bell curve webinar that I had done with SOFTRAX in 2010 that continues to enjoy wide popularity on the internet. And you can actually put in those keywords and find that particular webcast, even today.
That was a little before my time. That sounds like I'm going to spend my afternoon doing that, though. It sounds like I should brush up.
Well, I often say that I started doing all this stuff about 5 days after Columbus got here. So, yes, that was before your time. Not quite 5 days, but okay. Let's move on to the next set of factors. So there's about 3 more, if I remember correctly. And the next one then is the amount of uncertainty with respect to the amount of the consideration. Now, if that uncertainty is not expected to be resolved for a very long time, then it's less likely that you can actually develop reliable estimates. See, for example, if you give Best Buy 3 months, that's a much simpler horizon to forecast over, although I often say that forecasting is difficult and forecasting the future is even harder. But 3 months is quite a bit easier than a whole year. That's the point about that factor. The next factor that we look at then is that if the entity has a practice of offering concessions, and those concessions vary over time, then that makes the revenue stream highly variable, highly uncertain, and it's unlikely that you can develop good estimates if you've been doing that a lot. And then the last thing is the range of concessions or discounts that you offer. If that's highly variable and it changes over time, then it's unlikely that you can develop a good estimate. In fact, the example that Six uses here, so case A tells you about a company that has a pretty good idea what the returns are going to be, has good experience and great predictive content, and it normally does not give a lot of concessions. So there you can develop an estimate and you can recognize revenue upfront. The alternative that's offered is where 2 or 3 out of these 6 factors are not satisfied, and effectively the company is unable to develop a reliable estimate. By the way, I've used the word reasonably assured and reliable. Please keep in mind those are not in 606, but we're trying to develop things, and where I'm thinking not only of the basis and the type of analysis that you do, but also in terms of what kind of audit evidence you develop. So keeping all of that in mind, Now, note that the FASB does say here that this is supposed to be a qualitative assessment. So effectively, there's an argument you could make in here that I don't really need a lot of quantitative, but I find that it's better to have the data, better to analyze that, and to have a basis for reaching your conclusions. Okay, now then let's move on to our next slide, please. And here, what I'd like to do, again, note that we have these paragraph numbers and so on. Now, here's a very important component of the 606 revenue model for variable revenue. So not only do you have those requirements that have to be satisfied in order to develop an estimate, but the board also places a constraint. It says you're not permitted to recognize more than the amount that you have estimated that you're not going to have to give up or revise, like substantially revise. The constraint, therefore, you have to be very careful with is on the amount of the transaction price that you're recognizing. Okay, so this constraint is a very critical component. So not only, in a sense, I almost think of this as the third component, the third criterion. Remember, the first criterion was that you need sufficient evidence, either your own or that of competitors and others in the industry. The second criterion was the predictive content of that experience. It had to meet certain thresholds. The third is that there is also a max, in a sense, a constraint on the amount that you can recognize. So I sort of think about all three of these whenever I think about the expected amount of revenue when I have a variable revenue stream. Right, so please keep that constraint argument in mind. Okay, and then the amount of the variable consideration that is included, of course, has to be limited, okay, to the extent that it is possible, right, or highly probable if you're thinking about IFRS 15, as I put it in here, right, that a significant reversal would occur. So you do have to be very careful about that constraint, as I said. Please keep in mind that constraint is on the transaction price. And then finally, please keep in mind that it also applies to a fixed price contract, which might have certain variability, for example, due to a performance penalty or something like that, or a performance bonus for that matter. Okay. And then the other point is that the amount of the estimate that you've developed, right, and keeping in mind that that transaction price is constrained, that has to be updated every reporting period. Right? So when you have variable revenue, and if you estimate it for the first time at the end of the first quarter, then when you're preparing your second quarter financials, you'll have to evaluate that again. So it has to be updated. So please keep in mind. So now you've got a picture, in a sense, of how you think about this. It's the evidence, the predictive ability, the constraint that you have to keep in mind, and then the fact that you're required to update it every time you prepare a set of financials. Okay, and that will bring us then to our next polling question, right?
That's right.
So shall
I'll
we
go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll get this one fired up, and this one is a little straightforward. Where do you obtain information and training on the new standards? So in this case, you can feel free to answer all that apply. You can check more than one option if that is accurate. So please feel free to do that.
We understand that there's a constraint on live webcasts under the COVID-19 pandemic, but or live seminars, I should say, not live webcasts. I'm doing one right now. But, we're just trying to find out how you do this most of the time. So, and as Ian pointed out, you certainly, you might be using more than one. So we're all learning different ways of doing these things. And Ian, did you know that when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, there was a run on webcams, and The current delivery date is somewhere towards the second or third week of June.
That doesn't surprise me. The price probably doubled as well. I'll tell you, Tony, what I'm interested in is it looks like we have 6% of people saying podcasts right now. I'd be interested in which podcasts are actually relevant to this.
Yeah, in fact, that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up because interestingly enough, I am working on the script for a podcast right now. And I'd actually developed 3 different topics. And I just started working on the podcasts because I was just thinking that, podcast might be a good idea. Put the materials together and provide those. So I think that could be very interesting.
Agreed. So it looks like most people have voted. I'm getting a couple of notifications that people are having technical difficulties. People are having difficulties submitting their votes. So if for some reason you find that you can't submit a vote, please just send a message, ask a question via the question box, and I'll record your answer there. That won't affect your CBE eligibility. But with that, if you can vote, if you can submit an answer, please do so. And I'll go ahead and close the poll in just a couple of seconds here, and I'll bring up the answers and compare them to the previous responses.
Sounds good.
So here we have the historical answers. And Tony, this is actually pretty interesting. We have 45% of people saying that they prefer live seminars on the topic. We have 38 answer internal training. 75% say web-based training, which seems fairly consistent. 8% have answered podcasts, and 32% said others. So those obviously don't add up to 100 because of the availability of multiple answers. However, that seems to be a little bit different from the historical data.
Yeah, it is always interesting because our audiences change each time. The historical data that you have is from my past 4 monthly webcasts, and that keeps changing all the time. The mix of small and large companies changes because the smaller you are, the less likely you are that you have access to internal training because the day job takes up most of the day anyway. So for people to find the time to create and offer training would be a little bit hard. The larger you are, it's a different story, of course. And so but I'm very heartened to see that live seminars are that much higher preference because I've been doing this for a while and I've long preferred live seminars simply because I can engage with my audience and I can look at people, I can respond to their concerns right away, and I don't have to wait. In these webcasts, we need to be careful about the amount of time we have, and I can't always get to all the questions people ask. So it's sort of, although I do it, and I've been doing monthly webcasts for more than 5 years now, my preference remains for live. So it's very nice, very interesting to see. And the podcast number was pretty good as well. Excellent. So thank you. Let's move on to our next issue then. Next slide, shall we? Okay, so here we have case A. Okay, so I want to start with this, just simply tell you that on the 21st of January of this year, a company agrees to transfer control of, say, 1,000 units, of security software, antivirus software licenses to a distributor. Okay. Now, and then the price for each of those is $100. So 1,000 units have been transferred for $100 each. Okay. And generally speaking, what happens is experience tells us that this distributor can sell those 1,000 units in about 3 months. Right? So we begin with that. So it takes them 1 quarter to do it. We've transferred these on the 21st of January of 2020. Okay. Now, what we do then, by the way, don't be confused by the paragraph numbers. The reason that we have these paragraph numbers, and please notice that it is 606-10-55. Whenever the third string of numbers is 55, it always means that you're looking at implementation guidance. So in other words, I have adapted an illustration or an example that is in 606. So I've made a slight variation just to, because I wanted to work with the dates and the quarters and so on. But you can find the original example in 606. And while I'm talking about the codification, I also recommend very strongly that not only should you download the standard, but you should also download the basis for conclusions. The basis for conclusions is a very fundamental, critical component of the standard. It will help you understand the guidance a lot better than just reading the standard. And the other thing is that the basis for conclusions does not end up in the codification. So at some point, you will no longer find it on the FASB website. So please keep that in mind. Okay, so this is just a variation, as I said, on the example. Now, because this reseller, this distributor is allowed to return the number of unsold licenses, this is, of course, a variable revenue stream. The software developer looks at this based on past experience. So remember the criteria: past experience, either their own or that of others in the industry. You look at that experience and ask yourself, do I have sufficient experience to develop an estimate? And your second question is, does it have predictability? So effectively, this entity decides that they do have that ability. They decide based on their assessment and past experience, the predictability of the content of the past experience, current market conditions, comparing it to what the competitors are offering. For example, looking at the features of their antivirus software, comparing that to the software provided by others, competitors in the marketplace, and so on. Sorry about that. Okay, so this entity looks at all that, does the analysis, and let's move to the next slide, please. Got it. All right. Now, so because of the fact that we have a fair amount of experience, because it has predictive content, and looking at our analysis of not just the historical, the current market condition, but also the fact that we're only looking at 3 months of this entire period that we given the distributor to sell out those 100 licenses, we decide that in order to move the 1,000 units, we'll have to provide a 20% discount. And we feel quite comfortable that as a result, we'll be able to sell the 1,000 units within the 3-month period. So because this estimate is reliable based on, and it meets the criteria and so on, this entity, this software developer can recognize revenues of 80%, right? So $100 a unit at 1,000 units. So instead of 100,000, they'll take they can take 80% of that. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that we've met all the criteria and so on. And remember, this is January 21. So we now move on to our next slide. And the issue that I want you to think about here is this. I've made the initial assumption here that my quarter end is February 29th. So January 21 is when I sent these units over. on the 29th of February, when I'm preparing my financial statements, the information provided by the distributor tells me that sales are on track and my estimate of the discount is on track. You see, and I'm using the current conditions because although the COVID-19 pandemic had begun, February was a month, at the end of February, we were still thinking a little bit differently than we started doing in March. And now we roll ourselves forward into March, and there's the shutdown, there's the disruption to economic activity. And towards the end of March, the distributor has called and given us some information and said, well, traffic has slowed considerably. The sales have declined to some extent. So the estimate that was applicable on the 29th of February and was acceptable, I should have said, on the 29th of February, at the end of March, we now have additional information that tells us that, there are some problems here. And please keep in mind that the filing is normally done 45 days after the end of the quarter. So think about this. You've got a press release that you make a few days after the end of the quarter, and you make the announcement of your earnings, and one could argue that at that point, the estimate of the 20% discount would have been reasonable, even at the time that the release was made, right? However, the problem is that now at the end of March, early April, we do have additional information, right? So then the question becomes the number that we have for the end of February, the 80,000 or 80% of the revenue that we had taken for the total amount, because we expected to provide a discount of 20%, that raises some questions, because March and April sales have told us, and the growing knowledge that we have of COVID-19 tells us that there are some issues. Now, one way to think about this is that, on the 29th of February, you did not have enough information to say that there was a problem with your estimate, right? However, subsequently, you've learned that there is an issue. So, one argument you could make is that effectively what happens here is, although I might still be okay saying that 20% is a reasonable discount, my problem is that by the end of March, I know it's not going to work. Most likely it's not going to work because I have a higher, I may have to provide higher discounts. I may have a decline in sales and so on. So there's the issue when you have this 3-month outlook, right? Now, what I'd like to do is, before I take this further, let's move on to the next slide. And actually, I want to sort of do a variation on the case. So I'll just offer you that information, and then we can discuss the whole thing together. So remember, the first one, where the timeline is as follows, right? I deliver or transfer control of the licenses to the distributor on the 21st of January. My quarter end is the 29th of February, and I'm looking at a 3-month period for the distributor to sell those 1,000 units. What if I change that to saying that I normally give my distributor a whole year to sell them? So you see, now what happens is that although on the 29th of February, my estimate was reasonable, the information I have in March and April tells me that sales are not holding up. So there's a difference between the experience I had in the past and what I'm seeing today. However, I do have an additional factor, and that is my distributor has an entire year to sell out the 1,000 units. So now the question becomes, since I do have an additional year, what do I expect to happen in the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth? And now I'm talking about the fiscal quarters of this company. Remember, its quarter ended February 29th. So I'm not talking about calendar quarters anymore. I'm talking about the fiscal. So see, the interesting thing is that we're now saying that there's more time. Now the question becomes whether this dislocation or disruption from COVID-19 is temporary and will resolve itself in the second, third, or the fourth quarter. So in other words, now the assessment is what happens going forward. Now, if you look at the financial statements of some companies that normally provide good disclosures, one very good example that I was reviewing yesterday was Intel. Intel has a lot of these issues, and they have talked about how the pandemic is likely to affect things and the uncertainty and how it has affected their visibility into what's going to happen in the remaining quarters of the year. So it's a very, very important thing to look at these types of things. And one of the things that we'll do, as both Ian and I have pointed out, we're going to offer a second webcast in this series. We should have a few more disclosures, and I will then add some additional analysis of those disclosures to the May webcast. For now, they were just starting up and there wasn't that much in there, but I think we're starting to see people develop far better assessments of these. And of course, it's going to vary because it depends on the type of product. It depends on how much time. So in a sense, if I go back to the cases I've developed, if I only have one quarter, 3 months in which the distributor can sell, that puts a different amount of weight and a different emphasis on my estimate, right? If I have a whole year or more than one quarter, I look at it a little bit differently. And what I'd like you to do is think about it this way. You see, what we've got over here is, if I think about this in terms of a statistical distribution that I was using to develop my estimates, I realize that this is supposed to be a qualitative assessment, but as I said, I'm thinking that it would be better to have some statistical data to look back at and so on. So my contention here is that if you think about it this way, let's say that I was using a sort of a bell curve and saying that my median discount was 20%, and plus minus 15% of that 20%, right? So between 17 and 23% discounts, those work out 80% of the time. So if I take a direct application of the bell curve, then I could argue that 20% is the right number to use. You see, the question now is that because of COVID, maybe I had to offer a discount of 30% or 32% or a little bit more. So it's certainly outside my range. But the question is, how long is it going to remain outside my range? See, this is a different question than the lease concessions. Because in the lease concessions, if you have a 10-year lease and a few months of rent are deferred, then it makes sense to say that this is not doing violence to the economics of the lease. So it doesn't require a modification. But with variable revenue streams, you have a different issue. And it depends on other factors. Most things do. So you need a very careful assessment in order to determine what you should do. Okay? So then what I'd like to do is also effectively, so there's case B is what I have discussed already. So I've done a few of these slides, if you wish. So now, Ian, maybe it's a good idea to launch the third and final polling question. And then while we're doing that, we'll talk about a couple of things. And so if you would, that'd be great.
Yep, we certainly can. I'll go ahead and pull it up here. So this one is that sharing. This one will be about ASC topic 326, credit losses. So Tony, I don't know if you would like to elaborate on this question a little bit more.
Sure. So CECL, as we call it, current expected credit losses. So that's a new standard. You have to adopt it. There's a little bit of confusion because somebody has put into the CARES Act a clause that says certain financial institutions have 6 additional months and so on before they have to adopt it. I'm just trying to find out where you are with respect to current expected credit loss standard. So maybe you've not started your assessment yet. Second possibility is that you effectively have an initial read, right, and a preliminary assessment has been completed at your firm. The third is that a formal assessment has been completed. The fourth one is that you effectively have transition and major decisions have been made. And then finally, you have the buy-in from legal, from operations, and the audit approvals have all been obtained, and you're ready to go. So those are your possibilities. Okay, so we'll give them some time. And
Yep, votes trickling in now. So if you haven't voted yet, please just take this opportunity to do so. And I'll go ahead and close the poll in just a few seconds.
Okay.
Tony, would you like me to pull up the historical data for this question as well?
Yes, please. That'd be great.
Excellent. So I will go ahead and close in, say, 3, 2, 1. All right, now I will just skip ahead a couple of slides to the historical data. So you see it here. So Tony, today we have 51% of attendees voting that they have not started the assessment. We have 25% answering that they are in the initial read in their preliminary assessment. We have 10% within their formal assessment, 20% in transition or making major decisions, and 12% in legal and ops and audit approvals.
Okay, so the major difference was in that fourth category where they had 20 relative to. But that's interesting. Okay, very good. So let's do this. Let me just make a brief comment about the software implications. So for example, if you were doing something quantitative, such as the bell curve analysis, what this does is gives you some additional data. And the question is whether the additional observations that you have from the discount that you had to offer in March and April, and as you go forward, the additional discounts that you may have to offer, the decision you're going to have to make is how much of an impact, how much weight to put on those in your distribution analysis, in your bell curve analysis. So it helps to have software for this as well, to use software to do this. And that's what I wanted to tell you about with respect to at least an initial discussion of the implications of the pandemic for variable revenue streams. So Ian, you want to show them the slide about the May session?
Yes, I would be happy to. So thank you all for joining today. You can see here, we do have a follow-up session scheduled for May 26th, about a month from now, Tuesday afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern. So we hope that you'll all join. I'll send out an email after this alongside your CBE certificates and link to this webinar replay, just so you have the registration link conveniently in front of you. We'd love it if you could attend. And additionally, I'd just say it looks like we're running fairly low on time. So if you have questions, please feel free to send me an email. If you would like to speak to Tony, please go ahead and visit his website. And Tony, if there's anything else on your end.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian. Appreciate your help. And hopefully our audience found this useful, and we'll see you next month. And as Ian said, please send in those questions and make sure, you have to do a few more things. So don't close out your browsers yet, right? So those of you who want CPE, because you have to provide an evaluation, I believe, and things like that. So go ahead. But thank you very much, Ian. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you, everybody.
Bye.